Psalm 20 was written by David for the people of Israel to sing and pray, asking God's blessing upon the king before going out to war. In verses 1 through 5, David's giving the people a list of prayer requests so that they might properly pray for him. The assumption in these requests is that the king is seeking to do the will of God. In verse 1, we see that he's not going out to war to bring glory and power to himself, but this is a king who is in communion with God. In verse 3, this is a king who is worshiping God in the way that he desires to be worshipped. In verse 5, the king is fighting under God's banner, not his own. In verse 6, there's a transition, which is the hinge of the text, from prayer request to the bold and confident statement that David makes, "Now I know that the Lord saves his anointed." There's an expression of confidence that these prayers will be heard and that David will be blessed with victory. But what's the ground for this confidence? It's not David's skill as a warrior or a military tactician. Rather, it's the promises of God. There's a connection back to Deuteronomy 7, where God promised that if Israel would listen to his laws and keep them, that they would consume all the peoples that the Lord would give over to them. In verse 7, the psalmist states that Israel does not put their trust in chariots or horses, but in the name of the Lord. Now, this is not just a pious statement, as if David's actually surrounded by chariots and horses and about to lead a vast army out, and he's saying, meanwhile, that his trust is really in God. It's easy for us to do the same thing, to say that we would trust in God with a vast army of support at our backs and when all of our cares and concerns are headed for. But David's making a factual statement here. He does not have chariots or an abundance of horses. God had forbidden kings from accumulating them in Deuteronomy 17. Chariots were considered an offensive weapon. They were associated with empires like Egypt and Assyria, which Israel was not to be. Furthermore, as the most advanced weaponry of the time, they could serve to turn the people away from God as they placed their trust for their protection in the hands of a king with military might. We're told in 1 Kings 11 that it was actually Solomon who later began to acquire chariots, and as he did so, his heart was turned away from God. Finally, this is a messianic psalm. Its application extends beyond David to Christ. David's kingship represents and it's a picture of Christ's kingship. Christ also prayed before he went to war on the cross to win a victory that David could not. He prayed in John 17 for those whom the Father had given him, that they would be one, that they would be protected from the evil one, that they would be sanctified in truth. We can take comfort in the fact that we know Christ's prayers were answered. We're also told in Romans that Christ even now makes intercession for us. Verse 3 of this passage asks that God would remember the burnt offerings and sacrifices of the king. Likewise, we can rejoice and be confident that God remembers Christ's sacrifice and that we're justified once and for all because of it.